she had been evicted from her apartment in San Francisco in the fall of 1996. And the minivan that she was living in, it was pretty beat up. It was not in good shape. It had a bad engine block, and I don't really know what that means, but I do know enough to say that with a bad engine block, if you are hot in the summer and you go to turn on your air conditioning, I don't think it works very well. I'm not sure if that same thing holds true for heat. Georgia, she was afraid that somebody would call social services on her to report that she really wasn't doing well financially, at least not well enough to provide the basic necessities for her daughter, Jasmine. So, for several months, what Georgia did to make certain that nobody took Jasmine from her, she made it where really nobody could find her, and she would just drive around in this minivan with her daughter. She would, during the day, she would drive around, and then at night, they would end up finding an empty parking lot to spend the night there. So there was a lot of bouncing around and never really being in one place for too long. Now, Georgia, she was of Greek ethnicity, and she passed on those Greek physical traits onto Jasmine. Jasmine was this beautiful little olive-skinned, dark-eyed, beautiful girl, and you'll understand later on why it is that I mentioned the Greek roots. For Jasmine, it really did not bother her too much when they were just driving around all the time the way that they were, and this is because Georgia did a pretty exceptional job at making everything they did like an adventure. So Jasmine, she looked at it, I would guess, through, I would say, the lens of a 5-year-old, and she just chalked it up to, they were sleeping, like camping, that she figured that's what they were doing. They were camping, and so Jasmine, she was not enrolled in any kind of schooling, and because of this, Georgia took the time to show Jasmine some things, like she took her to trips to the beach, she took her to the zoo, the botanical gardens, and they also spent quite a lot of time at a favorite park of theirs. This park overlooks the San Francisco Bay, so they were able to, take these long walks, and they were both people watchers, and they would watch people fishing on the pier. And it was at that very same park that they would wash up, they would get themselves, get all that, I guess, minivan smell off of them or whatnot. And it's also where they cleaned their hair, because there was a public fountain there. decided that she really wants to do something special for Jasmine. Really, something she knew that Jasmine would love. And so she's driving around with her daughter, and she's pretending like she's lost. She keeps stopping and looking down at a map, and she's like, "Where are we? I don't know where we are. Oh, we have to go a different road, etc." And eventually, Jasmine, being as, little and young as she was, she grows pretty bored of this, and she ends up falling asleep. But that's what Georgia wanted her to do, because she did not want her to see where they were going, because she wanted to surprise her when she woke up in the morning. And so Georgia ends up going to the campus of Stanford University, and she parks there in the dormitory lot. Now, you may be wondering, why would a 5-year-old girl want anything to do with Stanford University? Well, it's because Jasmine, she was no ordinary 5-year-old girl. You'll come to see this. Georgia wanted to surprise Jasmine with a morning tour of the scientific laboratory that was there at Stanford. The laboratory was one of the world's premier scientific laboratories, and Jasmine had been dying to go there ever since reading about it in a book. Yes, you heard that correctly. Ever since she heard about it in a book. So Jasmine wakes up the next morning, and her mother tells her that she has a surprise for her. And so they get out of the van, and Jasmine's looking around, and her mom tells her that they're going to take a tour of the scientific laboratory that's there. And so they start lining up, and Jasmine was beyond happy to be there. She loved anything to do with electrons, x-rays, lasers, things like that. So they're on this tour, and when the tour ends, there's a question and answer session that takes place in the auditorium. And of course, Jasmine's so small, she and her mom sit in the very front row, and you can see Jasmine is just captivated by this particular physicist who is on stage conducting this Q&A. So suddenly, Jasmine raises her hand. Can you imagine being in an auditorium filled with college students, and this little girl is like asking a question? So the physicist calls on her and says, "Hey, what's your question?" And Jasmine asks him, quote, "How do you prevent the accelerator from melting down from all the heat created by the particle collisions?" Yeah, that's what she asked the physicist at 5 years old. And so the physicist was pretty taken aback by this question that was posed to him from this little 5-year-old girl. But to his credit, he answers her just like he would any other person in the room. And Jasmine seemed quite satisfied with that answer. So when the Q&A was over and people started to, file out of the room, the Arian was really impressed with Jasmine, and he asks Georgia if it would be okay that he be alone with Jasmine. And the reason for that was because he wanted to make sure that Jasmine was not being influenced by her mother, that the question that she asked was actually coming from Jasmine herself and not something her mom had told her to ask. And so Georgia agrees that, she can go into the doctor's office, Dr. Arian's office with her daughter, and they can be alone. And I know what you're probably thinking, because I thought the very same thing, but I promise you there's no nefarious reason as to why he wanted to be alone. And so they're in Dr. Arian's office, and he asks Jasmine, why did you ask that question? And Jasmine tells him that she wanted to know because, quote, particles moving nearly at the speed of light create an enormous amount of thermal energy that must be contained. Dr. Arian was pretty blown away at how advanced Jasmine was, and he ends up asking her other questions, such as physics principles behind a pendulum. And Jasmine starts describing oscillation and conservation of energy. And it was pretty amazing. It was at this point that Dr. Arian knew that Jasmine was actually the real deal. So he calls Georgia back into his office, and he asks her, how did Jasmine get so smart? And Georgia tells him, I can't take credit for it. Everything she knows, she taught herself. So now, let me jump back just a little so there's an understanding of Georgia and her life and how it came to be at this point. So let me give you some background. When Georgia was 36, she was pursuing a literature degree at Montana State University, and she became pregnant with Jasmine. But Jasmine was George's third child. She had already had 2 other children. She had a son named Apollo, and she had a daughter named Vanessa from a short-lived marriage when she was in her 20s. Georgia was poor and single, and because she had a pre-existing medical condition, a doctor warned her that if she were to carry the baby that she's carrying to term, that it would come at a great risk to her and the baby. He said that she would most likely hemorrhage and die. But Georgia had the mindset that if God had put it in, then she'll let God take it out. So in 1991, Georgia goes into labor at her house, and her midwife was this woman who was dating a veterinarian, and the midwife, before Georgia went into labor, she was helping her boyfriend deliver a calf. And as predicted, Georgia lost a lot of blood. And when Jasmine was delivered, the midwife ends up using the same clamp to clamp the umbilical cord that she used when they birthed the calf. And so in the following days, Jasmine ends up developing an infection, and Georgia suspected that it was from the clamp that had not been sterilized properly. But gradually, though, the mother and daughter, they end up recovering from their first shared brush with death. So it did not take long for Georgia to recognize that Jasmine was unusual. This because at 6 months old, Georgia started speaking, and at around 9 months old, she was reading. As a full-time student and single parent, Georgia did not have the time to homeschool Jasmine, so she would end up checking out a bunch of books, including novels and science texts, and she would check them out from the library from where she was going to school. And by the time Jasmine was 2 years old, she could write. And Jasmine had this kind of uncanny ability of presenting almost like an adult, even in the way she walked. She had this adult way about her. So Georgia, whose maiden name was Kotsaki, had grown up in Greece. Most of her youth she had spent in an all-female orphanage, and it was housed in converted military barracks, and it was surrounded by stone walls and barbed wire. Pretty cold, pretty clinical, and each orphan there, they were identified by a number that was inscribed on their bed frame. So that tells you just how much attention they really paid these orphans. And they did not eat much. They did not have a lot of food. In fact, the girls for breakfast would just eat a slice of bread with tea, and then dinner would just be watery soup with rice. And then at night, when they went to bed, they kind of looked like all the same. They all wore the very same white nightgowns, and they sometimes would get so hungry in the middle of the night that they would get up and sneak into the garden just to steal vegetables. At 16 years old, Georgia moved to New Jersey. There was an aunt living there, and she moved in with her. And then a few years later, she got married, and she had Vanessa, who is her first child. But when that marriage turned abusive, she left her husband and she moved across the country while she was pregnant with her second child, who she named Apollo. And they ended up in Bozeman, Montana. Bozeman, I don't know. I'm gonna call it Bozeman, Montana. But it hadn't been easy raising 2 kids alone, being a foreigner in a remote place, or even returning back to school in her 30s. But seemed out of control. She felt like she had a good grasp on life at that time, that for the very first time she felt liberated, getting away from that abusive situation and all. Now, as her third child, Jasmine began to flourish, and Georgia wondered if she really had something really rare on her hands, and she was feeling guilty for not being able to give Jasmine more. And she was also worried because Apollo, her son, he had shown very similar traits that Jasmine was showing. In his first year of life, he picked up English and Greek at a really quick pace, and then suddenly, just out of nowhere, he became nonverbal, and he drew into himself because of a developmental disability. So when Jasmine's intelligence continued accelerating past the point where Apollo's had lost momentum, Georgia was still scared. One of her biggest worries was that Jasmine may be singled out or even persecuted for her uniqueness, or even that she may attract unhealthy attention. However, over time, that worry got stronger to the point where she had to ask herself if Jasmine's abilities was a blessing or a curse. So, I read about this child psychologist who talks about the parallels between gifted children such as Jasmine and comparing that to children that are developmentally disabled or delayed, and the way it's presented is that you have one end of the spectrum where you have this incredibly gifted child, and on the other end of it you have a child that's the opposite of that. And even though they're miles apart, they're actually quite similar in that they struggle with the same issues of trying to find themselves, trying to find their path in order to articulate, in order to advance, and of course, they have the same social kind of biases from other people as well, so it's not very easy. And Jasmine proved no exception, and George's circumstances only magnified the challenges of raising Jasmine. In 1993, Montana's Department of Child and Family Services, they wanted to take Apollo away. And the reason for that is because they did not think that Georgia, who was a single mom on welfare, could provide the attention and resources that Apollo required. And so, rather than be forced to give her son up, Georgia rented a U-Haul and she packed her stuff and she left for California. And this was when she was just 5 credits shy of her degree. And Vanessa, she was 18. Vanessa is her oldest daughter. She was 18 at that time, and she had just recently so she ended up staying behind. So Georgia, Jasmine, and Apollo, they settle in San Francisco, and they live in this cramped basement apartment, and Georgia and Jasmine, they would sleep with one another in the same room, and then Apollo, he stayed in a different room, and he would sleep in a sleeping bag on the floor. But the apartment was super dank and dingy. It had mice running all over the place. It had a septic tank that overflowed, and because of that, there was this brown, septic waste water that came gushing in from a drain in the floor. So, I know that's pretty gross, but so Georgia, she gets a job, and she gets a job at the post office, and they paid her just $7 an hour, but she was able to work 7 days a week. However, the hours that she had to work weren't really conducive to, raising children. She worked 12-hour graveyard shifts, and she would leave in the late afternoon, and then she would come back around 6 o'clock in the morning. She was not able to afford childcare, so she would end up leaving Jasmine with Apollo, who Apollo was 16 at the time, and he was still not able to communicate fully, and so Jasmine and Apollo would be left together. And of course, Jasmine was only a toddler at the time, and because of this, she had an incredibly difficult time sleeping at night because, as I said, she and her mom slept in the same room. They slept in the same bed. So, of course, Jasmine was always unsettled and could never sleep. So, what she would end up doing is staying awake because she wanted to wait for her mom to come home. And what she would end up doing is reading books all night long. And when Georgia would have a lunch break, which was around midnight, that's when she would call Jasmine, and she would ask her what she was reading, and Jasmine would tell her, everything she was reading. So that's probably one of the ways Jasmine was so advanced, and yeah, I can kind of relate a little bit of a different story, but I definitely taught myself how to read by the time I was 3 years old. And my circumstances were, I wouldn't say very similar, but had some similarities, and so I get that whole throwing yourself into something that takes your mind elsewhere. So Jasmine's mind was like a sponge. Everything that she read, she remembered. I guess I would say almost like an eidetic memory. And even though she was so brilliant and she showed an interest in various subjects, the one that she loved the most was math. Georgia had introduced the subject of math to Jasmine with counting beads. You guys know what those are, those counting beads. At first, I thought that it was an abacus, but it's not. They're called counting beads. And so, Georgia would sit with Jasmine and demonstrate subtraction by removing a few beads from the set, and Jasmine would tell her mom, like, that's simple, and then Georgia would ask her to subtract 4, 5, and 6-digit numbers from others just as big, and So before long, she started solving large problems using a pen and paper, and by the time she turned 3, she had mastered fractions, decimals, and multiplication. Next came geography, history, and literature, including Greek poems and plays such as Antigone and Orestes, and she also loved Charles Dickens novels. She would devour them all before she was old enough to enter kindergarten. She also showed exceptional ability on the piano. Her knowledge and aptitude for math, though, is what kept inspiring awe in her mother. And by age 4, Jasmine was doing algebra. When Jasmine turned 5 in 1996, Georgia tried to get her into the public education system, but the elementary, middle, and even high schools, they all told Georgia that there was no way that they could accommodate Jasmine. Then she heard about a school called the Nueva School, and that was a private academy for gifted children. The tuition was beyond her means, but she hoped that by demonstrating Jasmine's intelligence that she could secure a scholarship for Jasmine. So Georgia paid about $200 for Jasmine to take the IQ test in order to get into that school, and it took Jasmine less than an hour to take that test. And so while they waited around for the results, one day they get them, and Georgia was stunned. I mean, she knew her daughter was intelligent, but she opens up the results and she sees that Jasmine had scored in the 99.9th percentile. It's pretty impressive. That's when she knew that Jasmine was indeed a prodigy. So Georgia and Jasmine were really looking forward to getting a jump start on Jasmine's academic career. But unfortunately, tragedy struck that summer. Back in Montana, Vanessa, who was Georgia's oldest daughter, she was on her way to a water park, and she was with her husband, her 2-year-old daughter, and her brother-in-law when their car overturned on a highway. Vanessa's husband suffered a heavy blow to the head, and he was pronounced brain dead by the time he reached hospital, and he was pulled off of life support shortly after. Vanessa was paralyzed from the chest down, leaving her to be a single mother. Vanessa's daughter and her brother-in-law, they had some scrapes and bruises, but otherwise they were unharmed. So, of course, Georgia knew that she was definitely going to have to go be with Vanessa, with her being paralyzed and being a single mother. And so Georgia talks to her landlord, and she explains the situation to him, and he was very receptive to her needs, and he told her, go take care of your family, it's a tragedy, don't worry about a Georgia got herself and Jasmine and Apollo, and they end up driving to Montana to stay with Vanessa, her daughter. So they end up staying at this Lutheran center in Billings, Montana, which was a residence for the families of medical patients. Georgia did laundry, cooked, and cleaned for Vanessa, and she helped her acclimate to her wheelchair. And Jasmine was excited because her niece, Cassie, was there, and she would play with her, and they would do fun things like planting acorns in Dixie cups just to watch the seedlings sprout. When Vanessa was assigned a health aide by the state, Georgia took Jasmine and Apollo back to San Francisco. She expected to find her apartment and her job waiting for her. But her landlord, who had told her not to worry about rent, had evicted them. The post office would not let her work because she didn't have a permanent address, and so other potential employers told her the same thing. So basically she was in a vicious cycle because her lack of employment kept her from finding a new place to rent. So when that all happened, that is when the living in her minivan began. Given his circumstances, Apollo was sent back to Montana to stay with Vanessa, and then from there he went to New Jersey to be cared for by extended family members. And for Jasmine, that was incredibly difficult because that was her brother, and she was so used to having him around, and with so little social interaction with other kids, yeah, it was pretty hard on her. And so Georgia and Jasmine, they had their life. It was just the two of them. And so what ended up happening is that Jasmine's mother and the minivan and books became Jasmine's whole world. So now remember back when Jasmine was at the tour at Stanford. So Jasmine, of course, she was discovered on the tour, and Dr. Irian's conversation with her impressed him enough that he suggested that Georgia enroll Jasmine in what is called Stanford's Education Program for Gifted Youth. And so that was a series of distance learning classes developed for children with exceptional academic ability. Around the same time, Georgia won a settlement from her old landlord. Not only was the eviction deemed unlawful, but the court also found that the sewage in the basement to be uninhabitable. So with that money, she and Jasmine finally had options. So the two relocated permanently to Montana, which is where Jasmine began taking her classes on a desktop computer in their Bozeman apartment. In consecutive 3-month semesters, Jasmine completed courses in algebra and calculus, all before her 8th birthday. Even in a program for brilliant kids, her performance raised eyebrows. There were some people that were quite skeptical of Jasmine. In an article published internet been taken by a child as young. Officials of the gifted program that Jasmine was taking were so skeptical that they had Jasmine's math teacher, who her name was Janet, they had Janet travel to Montana to confirm that Jasmine was doing her own work. And Janet and Jasmine, they had their own online rapport by this time. They got along quite well, and she gave Jasmine these incredibly difficult math problems to solve, and Janet later told a reporter that Jasmine was at least 10 times brighter than the brightest student she has ever had. In 1998, the 48 Hours, the CBS documentary series 48 Hours, they were looking for subjects for an episode called Whiz Kids. The producers heard about Jasmine through the Stanford faculty and sent a crew to Montana in the late fall. What they were doing was capturing a day in the life, and so a reporter shows up at 6:30 in the morning, and they film Georgia and Jasmine throughout the day, and to them it was obvious that Jasmine was a prodigy. Jasmine was going to graduate with her bachelor's about the age of 11, and she could have her master's degree and then her PhD by the age of 15. So after the Whiz Kids episode aired in December 1998, people stopped Georgia in public to say that they recognized her from the show, including during a trip to New Jersey to visit family. There was also media coverage from Montana outlets that previously had no idea that they had a child genius living there. The president of Montana State University decided to let Jasmine take courses for credit. At age 8, she became a college student. When she was allowed to declare a major, she chose math. Because Jasmine was a minor, Georgia went to class with her every day, and Georgia claims that it was the greatest time of their lives. She said that all Jasmine cared about was learning, and as long as she learned, she was a thriving child. With Jasmine being the prodigy that she was, a wealthy Bozeman, Montana family, they had offered to cover Jasmine's tuition, but the costs of textbooks, supplies, and transportation strained George's finances to the limit. She wasn't really able to do it. Going to school with Jasmine made getting any kind of steady job impossible. So she did the best that she could by cleaning faculty houses and student dormitories. When the minivan broke down, Georgia could not afford to replace it, so she and Jasmine walked 16 blocks to the school every single day. Jasmine struggled socially. Local kids would gang up on her, and Jasmine made the mistake one day of trying to explain a math problem to one of these kids that was making fun of her, and from then on, whenever she was around these kids, they would chase her and try to bait her Jasmine spoke with big words and sober mannerisms. They would viciously mock her every single time she saw them. Students at the university, they could also be malicious. One student told Jasmine to go home and play with her Barbie dolls. Others complained about having to partner with a baby in labs. In the brief moments when Jasmine and her mother were separated, such as taking a bathroom break or running back to get a textbook, Jasmine was sometimes pushed around in the halls. She would have to use her arms as a shield, keeping them crossed in front of her with her elbows sticking out. You know what I mean? When, like, you're trying to keep somebody from, like, coming near you. So, despite having to fight her way through these miserable bullies, in December of 2004, when she was 13 years old, Jasmine completed the coursework for her degree. She graduated the following May, becoming the youngest person in Montana State University history ever to do so. Jasmine told a journalist covering her graduation that she wanted to get another 4 or 5 bachelor's degrees before getting her doctorate because she wanted to study as many subjects as she could. So in anticipation of her graduation, Jasmine had decided that she wanted to change her name. She spent a lot of time thinking about the name that she wanted. She wanted to make sure that the name would describe her in a way that she was bracing idealism and ethical vision. So she ends up settling on a 4-part Greek moniker. So her name, she changed her name to Promethea Olympia Kyrene Pi Theta. So where she got Promethea is a feminine form of Prometheus. He was the Greek titan who gave fire to humankind. And it also comes from the Greek word for forethought. Olympia is the region where the Olympic Games originated. Kyrene was a daughter of the god Hermes and a feminist prototype participating in men's sporting competitions and founding her own colony. And then finally, the inspiration behind Pi Theta was 2 reasons. One, it was the name of the mother of the Greek mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras, and it sounded a lot like the name of the high priestess at Delphi who foretold the future. So the girl who is now Promethea, yeah, it's Promethea, I think I was saying it incorrectly because it's all Greek. So Promethea, she believed that her life and its work would have meaning. So from now on, I'll be calling Jasmine Promethea because that is the name that she chose for herself. So at 15 years old, Promethea goes back to Montana State University for her next bachelor's degree, this time in physics. Ever since watching Carl Sagan's documentaries as a little girl in San Francisco, she had been fascinated by physics. So, in a jarring sequence of events, George's sister passed away, and she left her some money. Under the terms of the estate, the money had to be spent on a home was 24 miles away from the university. And she also got a car so that she could drive Promethea to classes. And Georgia states to this day that moving there was the worst decision they had ever made. So this house, this new house, this ranch, it was located in an area called the Wine Glass area, and if you look on a map, you'll see why. It has winding roads and these homes that are scattered over a bunch of hills and valleys, and it's all connected by these unpaved roads that are covered in loose rocks and pretty tall prairie grass. So as soon as they moved there, Georgia and Promethea, they felt quite isolated. They butted heads with their neighbors. They found their neighbors to be very cold and unfriendly. There were all kinds of problems going on, and Georgia became involved in several legal disputes, as I said, regarding property boundaries and other matters too. Looking back on it, reading the neighbors' complaints, I wondered, because Georgia and Promethea were kind of codependent, and I wondered maybe because they seem so socially isolated, not really, talking to too many people, that perhaps the neighbors saw them as maybe not, like most of your neighbors you talk to and you're friendly, and maybe they made a mistake thinking that they were cold, but they were anything but. Promethea's schedule was really, really hectic. On a typical weekday, she would get up around 5 o'clock in the morning to have breakfast, and then she would have to get to a 1-hour commute to get to the university. And at this time, Georgia was still going with her everywhere, and in order to pass the time, she would read newspapers and how-to manuals to make home repairs. And then after her classes, Promethea, she would go to a lounge in the engineering and physical sciences building, and she would go there to review her notes. She was meticulous in her notes, and this could keep her on campus past midnight, after which Georgia drove her home, and they slept 2 or 3 hours before waking up and doing it all over again. So the days were long at the university for another reason. Their home had plumbing and heating problems, and Georgia struggled to pay contractors to fix them. She and Promethea would be really cold in the middle of the frigid winter, of course, in Montana, and the temperatures could plummet to minus 30 degrees. In order to bathe, they would boil water, and if Promethea had to do homework, she would sit at her desk, bundled in a heavy jacket and gloves. smartest person, she was also the most generous, sweetest, and most respectful. Promethea used to bring them eggs, fresh eggs, from the chickens that she raised on the ranch. The professors found Georgia, so Promethea's mother, they found her to be outrageously protective even after Promethea turned 18. Her mother insisted on going everywhere with her. Instead of diminishing over time, the fears of bullying and physical danger had hardened, and the way Georgia and Promethea operated as a unit had become ritualistic. They're always scanning for threats and vulnerabilities. They were always planning ahead to avoid worst-case scenarios. To observers, Promethea and Georgia, they appeared to be getting ready for a storm that only existed in their imaginations. They seemed colossally paranoid about the world, and they would talk excessively about the awful things that might happen. And then, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, the awful things started really happening there in Montana. In 2006, things started to get really strange. The donor family that had supported Promethea had agreed to cover tuition, but only for her math degree. For her physics education, she had to look elsewhere for funding. Promethea entered and won an essay contest that was sponsored by the Pan-Hellenic Scholarship Foundation, which is a non-profit that helps pay for Greek American students' college educations. She was awarded $10,000, and she was later invited to speak at the Festival of the Three Hierarchs, which is a banquet held every January in Chicago in order to commemorate the founders of the Greek Orthodox Church. So Promethea starts doing research for the subject of her speech, and as she's researching this, she starts realizing that she wasn't really behind all of that research. She was very upset to find out that there were these bishops who were complicit in tyranny of early Christianity. And so basically, in her own words, she said that there's really no way to describe the history of the early Orthodox Church other than saying it was religious fascism. So she was very, very put off by that, and she decided that she was going to write this speech and tell the truth about how she felt about it. And she wrote a 150-page speech actually criticizing the church's history. And she knew that when she got up there to talk about it, that it was going to take several hours. But she didn't care because she wanted people to know how she felt about it. In January 2007, she and her mother fly to Chicago, which was an all-expenses paid trip to go to the festival. They had a car waiting for them at the airport, and there was a representative from the Greek church who was really eager to meet Promethea because she had been hearing, what a prodigy she is from all of her colleagues. So for her speech, Promethea decided that she's going to wear an authentic Greek outfit, and this is because she wanted to celebrate her heritage. But the handler from the church tried to tell her that she should not wear that and she has these two powerful priests by her side, and she ends up delivering her speech in Greek. The entire room took on a really strange energy. The more Promethea talked, the tenser the room got. Georgia realized that no one expected to hear the truth that was coming out of her mouth. So about 20 minutes into the speech, a man working the event's film equipment began yelling, accusing Promethea of blasphemy. When she paused, a bunch of people were yelling at her, and some of them were really angry. But there were a few who wanted her to finish. They were telling the other people, like, hey, relax, let her finish her speech. So the priests that were seated on either side of her, they were not happy, to say the least, and at one point, Promethea was handed a card, and it said, "You're finished." But she continued delivering the speech, and her voice got louder and louder because she did not want to be drowned out. But people were becoming more angry, and the people in the crowd were getting louder, and finally it just became all too much, and she just walked off the stage. And unfortunately, she only got through a fraction of what she had written. So there's this video on YouTube that you can watch, and I will try to remember to link it. Oh no, my next door neighbor is home, and he's outside playing basketball. This dude plays basketball, I swear, from sunup to sundown. It never stops. And all you can hear is the basketball thud over and over. I ordered a crossbow, and, not that I'm going to kill him or anything, but I ordered a crossbow because my next door neighbor bought this motion light, and he attached it to his garage, and so my bedroom window, every time the wind blows, his light will come on, and my whole bedroom will light up. So I got so angry like 2 weeks ago, and I was like, that's it, I'm ordering a crossbow. I'm gonna take my bow and take out that light. Not that I really ever do that. Anyway, so this event that Promethea is in, the people are running around, they're super angry, and a bunch of guests, they end up going to Promethea's table. Some of them were really pissed off, but others were congratulating her for being so courageous. Women approached her in the bathroom asking for her contact information, and they also gave Promethea their information. The video of the speech, as I said, was posted online, and it got quite a bit of notoriety and admiration throughout the Greek diaspora. Promethea received death threats in the mail, but she also got fan letters. Now, a few months later, Promethea and Georgia are in a car accident. It was on a mountain in Montana, and Georgia was rushed to the emergency room, and she begged the triage nurse not to admit her because she had to take her kid to school the next day. And of course, Promethea insisted otherwise, and Georgia was diagnosed with broken ribs and facial bones and a broken sternum. When news of the accident spread through the Greek community, supporters helped cover Georgia's medical expenses, and they chipped in to buy her a new car. One man, who was 77 years old, by the name of Thomas and they accepted, but they decided to go to Greece instead. So when they come back from this vacation, their relationship with Thomas, so he's the one I just said that paid for the trip to Italy, but they went to Greece. So Thomas, you'll hear a lot about him. Thomas lived in Newport Richey, Florida, and they had never met him in person, but their relationship took a really bad turn. Over email, he asked that Promethea check in with him regularly. He made it clear that he could not stand for her to be at Montana State University, which he considered an average public university and an off-the-radar state compared to Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, or Columbia, where he said that he had once worked. As Promethea put it, she had to go to an Ivy League college so that she could become famous and well-known, so that she could in part reflect that fame on him. Thomas got even stranger when he told Promethea that if finances were an issue, that she could just live with him, even though his home was nowhere near any of the universities that he found worthy of her. He referred to himself as Pepoulos, meaning little grandfather in Greek, and he would refer to Promethea as Aganola, which means granddaughter. From 2007 to 2009, Thomas sent Promethea thousands of dollars intended for her education. Troubled by his gestures, she and Georgia refused them. Promethea also rejected packages that he sent in the mail. He would send books and other gifts. And so Promethea eventually stops responding to his emails. This only seemed to make Thomas more obsessed, and he grew convinced that Georgia was responsible for Promethea's rejection of him. He kept writing and harassing Promethea, telling her that she was being brainwashed by her mother. Thomas called and wrote to officials at Montana State University. He called to voice conspiracy theories. He claimed there was something scandalous, maybe even depraved, going on in the house that Promethea and her mother lived in. He also contacted the Bozeman local newspaper, saying that Promethea was a slave. He told the newspaper in a 2009 interview that Promethea is in bondage. He provided what he claimed was evidence, which included canceled checks that he had tried to send to Promethea and a copy of the Whiz Kids segment. He had watched the episode over and over, looking for clues that Promethea was afraid of Georgia, who he said was a cruel, domineering mother who bent her daughter to her will. He had created for himself a version of events that he liked, where he could be the hero and Georgia could be the villain, which would give him an excuse to step in and take over Promethea's life. When neither Montana State University nor the newspaper found his claims credible, the newspaper actually did look into the accusations, but they turned up nothing, and so Thomas ends up hiring a private investigator, and he tells the investigator to look into George's finances. He says that the car accident that they got into in 2007, that there was something fishy going on with that. One day in 2009, the investigator visits the ranch and he's in disguise, trying to say that he has a special courier package from Thomas, and he wanted to know exactly who was rejecting his mail. This was his whole purpose of sending this package. So he felt that if Georgia sent the package back on her daughter's behalf, that Thomas would have some proof to feed his theories. But it was Promethea who met this investigator at the gate and turned him away. For a while, there was radio silence from Thomas. Then in 2011, January, he called the newspaper for the first time in a year. He left a message saying that Promethea and Georgia would be in a courthouse in the coming days to testify as witnesses in a civil trial pertaining to road use near their home. He had found out about the case through the private investigator, and he thought the newspaper should cover it. As usual, no one took him seriously. What the paper didn't know was that Thomas was no longer in Florida. He actually was in Bozeman, and he had been there for months. At the end of October 2010, Thomas had left the house where he lived alone in Newport Richey. He had given his neighbor a key and some money for lawn care and newspaper delivery. He told her that he was going to visit friends in Montana, which was also where his favorite grandchild, who is a brilliant young woman, had attended college. Then Thomas had flown to Bozeman, where he checked in to a Days Inn. And at this Days Inn, Thomas, who was now 81 years old, was very well liked by the employees there. Thomas spoke about Promethea, saying that she was in danger and saying that he was certain that her mother was exploiting her and he was there to save her. The room where Thomas was staying often smelled like vinegar, which is what he used to clean his urinary catheter. According to court documents, his possessions showed someone who had pared down his life to a single purpose. Under his mattress was a zipped-up bag containing his passport, a checkbook, credit cards, and checks made out to his son, Costas. And attached to the bag was a note with instructions for sending it to his son's New Jersey address without further explanation. Next to the bed were records from the travel agency that he used, showing information for a one-way plane ticket to Montana, dated October 28, 2010. Several sets of directions to Georgia and Promethea's ranch were scattered around the room. The nightstand held a box for a semi-automatic pistol with a sales receipt and a business card from a gun shop in Hudson, Florida. In a suitcase, there were copies of the paperwork for an education trust that Thomas had set up for Promethea. The document stipulated, "In no event shall the trustee provide for any educational costs relating to Promethea's attending any university, college, program, or other schooling in the state of Montana mailbox, as well as all telephone numbers, email, etc., for as long as Georgia is alive, must also be considered null and void. For as long as Georgia is alive, all communications are blocked. And taped to the bedroom mirror was a scrap of paper with one word written on it: Pepulis. In January of 2011, Thomas finally made his presence known to Promethea. By then, she was 19 years old, and she had finished her second degree, and she was planning to start a third bachelor's in computer science, while also pursuing a PhD in physics. At the courthouse, remember they were at a trial for the accident, so at the courthouse, Promethea was sitting on a bench in a hallway, and she was waiting to testify in the road use trial. Oh yeah, that's what it was, the road use trial. And she was sitting there when an old man took a seat next to her. She told him that she had the flu, hoping that he would move away. But instead, he moved closer to her. She asked him if she knew him, and he handed her a small card, just like the paper that was on the hotel mirror, and it read Pepulis. Although she had never seen Thomas in person, the shock of recognizing the Greek word terrified Promethea. She told him that she did not want to see him ever again, and she rushed off to the sheriff's office, which had a dispatch window in the courthouse. But Thomas just followed her. Promethea told the sergeant that she was being harassed. She pointed to Thomas, and the sergeant told him to leave, but Thomas refused. He argued that it was a public building and he was entitled to stay. Again, the sergeant tells him to leave, and Thomas tells Promethea Thomas says to the sergeant that Promethea's mother was keeping her in a concentration camp. Promethea asked for a no stalking order, which the sergeant and the supervisor issued, and they had Thomas sign it before they escorted him from the building. Over the next few days, Promethea was nervous and jumpy. She knew that if Thomas hadn't gone back to Florida, that he was likely just a short drive away. But she took small comfort in the fact that the ranch where she lived was hard to navigate, and that was due to the steep, winding roads, especially if somebody was not familiar with the area. So, with the stalking order and the difficult terrain, Promethea hoped that she and her mother would be safe. The following Monday was Martin Luther King Day. Daytime temperatures can get down to single digits during a Montana winter, but that day it was in the high 40s. Promethea and her mother ended up sleeping in. They had their morning coffee and they talked at the kitchen table. Just before noon, Georgia decided to go for a walk. She hadn't slept very well, and she had terrible nightmares. So, in order to ease her mind a bit, she wanted to meditate. No sooner had she left the house, Georgia hears a loud noise near the front of the property. So she goes to check it out, and she sees that somebody was ramming the front of a pickup truck into their tall, locked gate at the head of the driveway. She runs back inside to yell to Promethea to grab the camera, but Promethea had already went outside to side window, Thomas told her that if she was so afraid to talk to him, there must be something wrong with her. She went back inside to get the phone and the camera. When Georgia saw who the driver was, she wondered if she could put an end to the whole ordeal by meeting face to face with Thomas. She and Thomas were both Greek, with ties to the old country, so she thought if they talked, and that he saw that she was not evil, maybe it would be enough to get Thomas to stop harassing them. So Georgia stepped out of the house and walked toward Thomas, who had come out of his truck and was standing on the far side of the gate. When she was within a few feet of him, she realized that he had a gun in his hand. Thomas raised the pistol and fired, hitting Georgia in the neck. When Promethea, who was still inside the house, heard the shot, she called 911. Once she was on the phone with the dispatcher, she ran into the yard. Georgia had collapsed, and she was curled up on her side in the grass. Thomas had shot her another time, and another, and he was still firing. Promethea ran towards the gate, and she threw herself on top of her mother, thinking that Thomas would stop shooting because he wanted Promethea alive. She was screaming at him to stop, calling him a bastard. But Thomas just looked at her, and he asked her why she was crying. He told her that she should be happy that her mother was going to die. Still on top of her mother, Promethea remained on the phone with 911. She tried to keep an eye on Thomas, who was pacing back and forth on the far side of the gate, looking for another clean shot. Then he stopped. Thomas then reached into his truck and he pulled out a blue bag, and he threw it on the ground near Promethea and her mother. It had $720 in cash and a copy of the education trust. Then he got behind the wheel of his truck, turned the ignition, and reversed for a few yards before swinging around and back in the truck's bed up to the green gate. Through the windshield, he now faced the gravel driveway, which was about 100 yards long, leading away from the house. It was the only way in and the only way out. To save Georgia, law enforcement would have to get past him. Promethea kept yelling, telling Georgia to keep fighting, but Georgia was slipping into unconsciousness and her lips were turning blue. The same officers who had dealt with Thomas at the courthouse were notified that there had been shots fired at the ranch, and there was a victim who had been hit. Promethea was on the line, and the suspect was still armed. The officers knew who the shooter had to be. It took them 10 minutes to arrive at the ranch. There was an ambulance close behind. When they saw Thomas, they used a squad car PA system to order him out of the truck with his hands up, but he didn't respond. The officers could not see Promethea and Georgia because Thomas had blocked their view of where the women lay crumpled on the ground. The sergeant radioed headquarters for a victim status update. Emergency dispatch, still on the phone with Promethea, said that Georgia was losing a lot of blood. The officers debated their options. they decided that one officer would drive slowly toward Thomas, while the other officer approached on foot along the passenger side of the vehicle, using it as a shield. It had begun to drizzle. The officer put on a coat and loaded his rifle. The other officer started rolling his car toward Thomas's truck. When they got close enough, they could see that Thomas was in the driver's seat with his right arm resting on the center console. The gun was in that hand, its barrel pointing toward the front of the truck. His finger was on the trigger. Thomas was ordered to drop his gun, but Thomas yelled back to the officers to put their guns down. They sensed that Thomas was trying to keep the ambulance at bay for as long as possible. They saw Georgia lying on the ground, not moving, and Promethea with blood on her hands. Thomas told the officers they would have to shoot him. But, however unhinged he was, Thomas had not tried to attack them. In fact, he didn't budge as they got within a few feet of his truck. Officers saw him fiddling with the buttons on his door, the ones controlling the truck's windows and locks. That's when they decided to make a move. With the butt of his rifle, the officer attempted to shatter the driver's side window, which was halfway down, but the glass only cracked. That was when Thomas finally reacted, swinging his gun up and pointing it directly at police. Both officers opened fire. Each got off 9 shots. Thomas was dead in a matter of seconds. Promethea picked herself up from her mother's body and unlocked the gate. Officers radioed the ambulance to drive in. When it got to Georgia, her eyes were open, but she was not responsive. Thomas had shot her 5 times. Georgia's wounds ranged from her neck to her torso to her legs. One shot had been devastating, severing her brachial plexus and puncturing a lung before the bullet became embedded near her spine. Another bullet had struck her small intestine, and a third had fractured her hip before putting a hole in her bladder. Georgia underwent emergency surgery to remove the slugs. She was then put on life support and airlifted by helicopter to Montana's largest hospital. She went directly to the ICU, where doctors performed an endoscopy and later removed a portion of her small intestine. She dipped in and out of consciousness as medical staff inserted chest tubes to drain blood collecting in her lungs, checked her wounds, and monitored her internal organs for signs of failure. Promethea stayed with her mother. She couldn't sleep, but she wasn't distraught exactly. Her nerves were so frayed that she could only feel numb. She'd done all she could to save Georgia, but what if it wasn't enough? Promethea didn't know her extended family very well. There were no aunts, no uncles, no cousins or grandparents visiting the hospital, no one offering her support. Her older siblings' needs far surpassed her own and created emotional distance. Vanessa remained paralyzed, and Apollo, back in Montana and living in Section 8 housing, could not hold a job. She didn't have close friends. Math and physics were her passions, but they weren't flesh and blood. Without Georgia, Promethea would be utterly alone. So, the author who wrote about this story, he went to had not given a media interview since the immediate aftermath, and she was no longer enrolled at Montana State University. Mike could not find an email address or a working phone number for Promethea, and she had zero social media presence. Eventually, he makes contact with Promethea's lawyer, who said that he would forward the request to her. After a month of back and forth, Promethea contacted him, and she told him that she was open to having a conversation. It took another month of email exchanges to get Promethea to agree to speak on the phone. They discussed her unconventional education and her upbringing by her mother. Promethea explained that she got a lot more sleep, a lot more food, and a lot more everything than her mother did, because her mother had to provide for them both, and all she had to do was worry about studying. After 2 months of correspondence, Promethea agreed to let Mike visit her in Montana. Georgia had survived. After nearly a month of surgeries and other procedures in February 2011, she had been released and had returned to a hospital that she was originally in under Promethea's care. Promethea. She was left with a host of physical issues, including partial paralysis of her left arm, nerve damage to her neck and shoulder, and extensive abdominal problems. She'd been almost entirely housebound ever since. As Georgia once did for her, Promethea put her life on hold to help her mother recover. And Promethea was healing too. A clinical psychologist had diagnosed Promethea with severe post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive disorder as a direct result of Thomas's attack. Promethea no longer lived at the ranch. She had a small place in Bozeman, Montana, thanks to a work-for-rent arrangement with a local business where she repaired and upgraded computers. She also tutored students for the GRE. She didn't have a car, so she got to hospital to see her mother by relying on public transportation. So the author, Mike Mariani, in his own words said, "Initially, when we were one-on-one, Promethea's disposition disarmed me. Her mood was cheerful, but her affect flat, as though something had been stripped from it. I struggled to find my footing in conversation, because the usual notches and grooves weren't there. I also thought about how socially isolated she had been all her life, homeless and homeschooled as a young child, taking college classes by age 7, earning 2 bachelor's degrees with her mother by her side every day." One of the professors that taught Promethea had told Mike that Promethea never knew how to end conversations or begin conversations or ratchet herself back. "I experienced this while ferrying her through the Montana landscape. After small talk, which came in fits and starts, Promethea would shift into a high gear I was not ready for. She would talk about her family, then Greek austerity politics, then science, with nary a breath in between. There was no conversational ebb and flow. I didn't so much participate as try to steer her thoughts now and then with questions. But while it was clear that I was in the presence of the smartest person I had ever met, Promethea's intellect wasn't the most striking thing about her. She did not have the sarcasm, cynicism, or irony that many young people use to construct their personalities. Promethea had no ears, no hint of attitude, vanity, or ego. Perhaps in missing out on opportunities to develop her social self, she eluded artifice altogether.